So it's just a little after 7, and I think that it's time that we get started. So hello, everyone who is here now, and welcome to our Zoom presentation tonight by Joe Rocchio. My name is Lynn Graff. I'm the co-chair of the Seattle Naturalist Committee of the Mountaineers. We Mountaineers recognize and acknowledge that these natural environments that we'll be visiting tonight, of course, virtually, but then some in person, have been under the stewardship of the Pacific Northwest Indians who lived here for countless generations and still do. And this evening, we actually have the opportunity to feed our shared passion for the natural world, and by learning more about these unique environments. The Natural Heritage Program that Joe is the program manager for from the Washington DNR it connects conservation science with conservation actions by collecting, maintaining, and distributing data on these rare species and ecosystems, as well as providing a number of other services and products in support of conservation in Washington. So a little bit about today's program. I was interested to see some of the statistics which really reveal I think how much research is going on in these special areas, because they support diverse, there are numbers there, 2,600 native vascular plant species, 140 mammals, mosses, lichens, liverworts, fungi. I saw 341 species of birds. That's what I mean about specific research, because if you got an exact count like that, there certainly has been a lot done. So some of these species are unique to Washington and not found anywhere else on Earth. So, as I say, video's off, sound off, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat, because I think we will have plenty of time for Q&A. So, Joe, why don't you take us off and lead us on this virtual trek?
Hey. Well, thank you, Lynn, and many thanks to the Mountaineers Naturalists for having me here tonight. I'm always very excited to talk about Washington's biodiversity. And as Lynn mentioned, I currently manage the Washington Natural Heritage Program, and we are housed within the Washington Department of Natural Resources. But we actually work statewide, and so kind of our purview is really Washington's biodiversity, no matter ownership. So, and also just a little bit about the Natural Heritage Program. We are a part of an international network of heritage programs. There's a heritage program in every U.S. state, all the Canadian provinces and territories. And so we all share a similar methodology and a similar approach to documenting what's rare, where is it located, and then developing priorities for conserving these important species and ecosystems. And so I've been with the Heritage Network for actually this month, it is in 3 days. It'll be 25 years. I spent 8 years with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and then now working into my 17th year here in Washington. And for much of my time here in the program in Washington, I was one of the ecologists in the program. And so in that time, I've been really fortunate to have been able to walk through many of Washington's ecosystems and explore many of the rare species that occur there, et cetera. I'm sure many of you have as well. And so I'm sure you're going to see very familiar locations, habitats today. Hopefully learn a few new things about them. But what I'm going to give you tonight is just a brief tour of some of that incredible natural heritage. I will be focusing primarily on terrestrial biodiversity. One, that's my expertise, and that's what our program focuses on. But I will throw in some tidbits about some freshwater and marine ecosystems as well. But that's a whole other presentation, right? We just have an incredible diversity of freshwater and marine species as well. So with that, we'll kick it off. And we often, I think the term biodiversity seems like a simple explanation as to what it is, the number of species in a given area. But the heritage program, we kind of take a different perspective, and we think about biodiversity at a landscape scale, an ecosystem scale, species, of course, and then the genetic diversity of a species as well. All of that matters in terms of kind of sufficiently providing adequate conservation for our biodiversity. And so this talk will be structured around many of those elements, primarily landscapes, how ecosystems are embedded in those landscapes, and then focus on a few of the species that are associated with those specific locations. And by doing that, we kind of by default get at genetic diversity when we go to protect places. Although today is mostly just about sharing these places. So obviously, you know, an iconic image of Washington, right, is our evergreen forests. We all know that. I'm guessing most of us live here in the Puget Trough ecoregion here in Western Washington. And I think though I just gave a similar talk to Nature Serves Biodiversity Without Boundaries conference here in Seattle, and talked about how this is probably what most people think about when they think of Washington. But a third of the state really is non-forested. And so, you know, we have a really wide range of ecological diversity in the state that really, you know, is a result of the climatic and the geologic and topographic diversity that we have as well. And so I'm going to kind of kick things off by first exploring some of these, what we call abiotic drivers or non-biological things that result in the unique combination of species we see on the landscape. So our topography, you know, is obviously quite varied, and I'm sure most of you are exploring that quite often. But we have numerous mountain ranges, of course, with the Olympics. Apologies for my bright light here. The Olympic Mountains and the Willapa Hills kind of being on the western part of the state. And then we have a huge glacial trough in between the Olympics and the Cascades. And that's, of course, the Puget Trough here. We have the Okanagan Mountains in the north central part of the state, the Canadian Rockies in the northeast, Blue Mountains here, and then a very large, this is that large non-forested area in the Columbia Basin, which is really underlain by thick basalt deposits. Elevations resulting from that topography, you know, are quite varied. Of course, here in Western Washington, elevations drop pretty quickly from very high elevations down into the Puget lowlands, as well as the coastal plain on the western part of the peninsula. And of course, you know, our highest elevations are at our 5 stratovolcanoes, so Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, Rainier, Glacial Peak, and Mount Baker. And then over in the Columbia Basin, you can see that from the foothills of the surrounding mountains, elevations start to gradually decline towards the Columbia River. The geology of the state is quite varied. The Columbia Basin, as well as the southern part of the Cascades, are primarily dominated by volcanic rocks at the surface. The northern tier of the state is a mix of metamorphic, sedimentary, and volcanic rocks. You can see the diversity of rock types in this part of the state. There's a lot of unusual bedrock types up there, like limestone and serpentine or ultramafic rocks. And that can have a really important and unique effect on the critters that live there, on the biodiversity that's found in those areas. And then, as I just mentioned, the Puget Sound region is underlain by thick glacial deposits. And then the Olympic Peninsula is dominated by a lot of sedimentary and volcanic rocks, as well as glacial features. And speaking of glaciation, glaciers have had a significant impact on the state's topography. The northern tier of the state, shown here in this kind of light blue, was the continental ice sheet that came down into the state and then made its way into the Puget Trough ecoregion. And then we also had alpine glaciers that came out of the Cascades and Olympics that left similar glacial features, outwash and till, et cetera, in various parts of the state. And then, of course, is our channeled scabland country, which is a result of glacial floods that basically we had huge glacial lakes that were dammed by continental ice. And these lakes extended east into Idaho and Montana, and those ice dams broke many, many, many times. And those massive floods that resulted from those dam breaks, you know, resulted in the Columbia or the scablands, as well as portions of the Columbia River Gorge, and a lot of deposits even into the Willamette Valley from those floods. And so this map shows the average temperature of the coldest month in the state. So, you know, midwinter, obviously darker blue here is colder and lighter blue warmer. No surprise, coldest temperatures at the highest elevations in our mountains, but you can see that there's a pocket of really cold locations up here in north central Washington. It's also no surprise that's where a lot of our boreal kind of species make their way down into the state, is in this region of Washington. And then significantly, you can look at how warm, relatively speaking, the Puget lowlands are, and in general, Western Washington, something we're all aware of, but that has a very significant effect on our biodiversity. Conversely, you can see how warm, this is the average temperature of the warmest month. You can see how warm the Columbia Basin gets in the summer. It is the hottest and driest part of the state. And again, the Puget Trough being relatively mild, as well as the outer coast, of course, and then the mountains being cooler. Precipitation is highly variable. Our overall patterns, as you all know, is Western Washington is much wetter than Eastern Washington. And Seattle's rainy reputation, isn't because of the total amount of rain we get. I think Seattle's around 38, Olympia's around 50. But Seattle's not even in the top 30 of rainiest cities in the country. That's really where our reputation comes into play. But on the other hand, you go out to Forks on the western side of the Olympic Peninsula, they average about 120 inches of rain a year, very, very wet. And so statewide, but especially here in Western Washington, our precipitation patterns, again, are strongly seasonal. We all know how gorgeous our summers are. And so our precipitation is primarily falling between October and March. You can see on this map, the mountain ranges have a strong effect on precipitation patterns. The wettest locations are on the windward side of mountains. So you can see how wet it is on the windward side of the Olympics, as well as the Cascades. Wettest locations, wettest location in the continental 48 is in the Olympic Mountains. I think it's over 200 inches of rain a year. But as the crow flies, maybe 60 miles or so, one of the driest locations on the West Coast, north of Central California, and west of the coastal range, is Sequim. It gets around 16 inches. So really, really strong rain shadow that the Olympics produces in the San Juans and portions of the Puget Trough. And then, of course, the Cascades having a rain shadow effect in parts of Eastern Washington as well. And then, of course, to see the dramatic, you go from 200 inches in the Olympics, and there are places along the Columbia that get less or around 6 inches of rain a year. Very wide range of precipitation. All that to say, kind of summarize it climatically, Western Washington is a maritime climate. Pacific Ocean keeps our temperatures relatively mild, brings in lots of moisture, while Eastern Washington is much more continental in nature and much more similar to the Intermountain West that we find in the lower 48, where temperature extremes between winter and summer are much greater. And then, from all that abiotic diversity, if you will, as well as other factors, I'm just kind of touching the surface on things, but we can kind of integrate that and start classifying landscapes based on similar patterns that we see in those abiotic drivers. And we call these ecoregions. And so an ecoregion, again, has a distinct pattern of species composition related to its climate, its geology, its topography, et cetera, its hydrology. We have 9 ecoregions in Washington. You can see on this map here, they all extend into adjacent states and Canadian provinces. This is a closer look at those ecoregions. So the Northwest Coast includes the Olympic Peninsula and the Willapa Hills. It is the wettest ecoregion. We're all presumably located here in the Puget Trough, which again is primarily a low elevation ecoregion, also contains the majority of Washington's population. The Cascades are split into 3 different ecoregions. We have North Cascades, East Cascades, and West Cascades. And those differences are based primarily on geology as well as climatic differences. Columbia Basin is the largest ecoregion, also the hottest and driest, and as I mentioned earlier, non-forested for the most part. Okanagan ecoregion and Canadian Rockies are montane ecoregions. And we have, again, a very small part of the Blue Mountain ecoregion, which primarily in Northeast Oregon and a little part of Idaho, but we have a little bit of it there in the Southeast part. So within each ecoregion, you get a diversity of ecosystems. And ecosystems include things like salt marshes or rainforests, bogs, shrub, steppe, et cetera. Some ecosystems are restricted to one ecoregion. Some are found in many. And then in turn, each ecosystem supports a distinct assemblage of species. And similarly, some species are just found in one ecosystem, others cross ecosystems and ecoregions as well. But despite that, this way of kind of divvying up the landscape into ecoregions and then also into different ecosystem types is a very useful way. It creates a communication option for us to really have a consistent way of talking about the diversity we see on the landscape. In terms of how we do that for ecosystems, we use what's called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification. I'm going to get it a little bit in the weeds on this slide, and then I'll scale up a little bit so that I'm not constantly throwing too much of this technical stuff in subsequent slides. But the U.S. National Vegetation Classification, as its name suggests, is meant to classify vegetation across the United States. In fact, it's part of an international vegetation classification that uses a very similar approach. It's hierarchical, which means that and it's a nested hierarchy, which means each level gets finer and finer. And so at the top, we have what's called a biome. And so this example here is our temperate boreal forest and woodland. And as you move down into that hierarchy, the units become more constrained by some, we start grouping them according to similar climate, geology, all those factors I was talking about, so that by the time you get to what's called an association, you're talking about a very fine scale plant community. But nonetheless, it's all nested and part of the same classification. But as I move through this presentation, I'm going to label the ecosystem photos you see. I'll probably be using some common names to help kind of translate, but I'll also, just to help kind of disseminate this information, include the U.S. National Vegetation Classification group name, and that's this level 6. And we often get asked how many ecosystem types we have in the state of Washington. And I'm always like, well, it depends, and as you can see in this middle column, it depends on what level in the classification I answer that question with. And typically we target that level 6 group because it does a nice job of not getting too deep in the weeds, but also it's fine enough that we're really pulling out this unique variation that we have in the state. So altogether, and Lynn, I'm going to really kind of quickly move through this slide because Lynn already summarized it for me, which is awesome. But the point is that we have, really incredible diversity associated with these landscapes and ecosystems. And many of these species are endemic to the state, especially plants. We have 84 plants that are only found in the state of Washington, nowhere else. And the Olympic and Wenatchee Mountains, as well as the Columbia River Gorge and the Columbia Plateau, the Columbia Basin, are all rich in these endemic species. All right, so now we're going to kind of kick off on our tour across the state. We don't have time to go through all 9 ecoregions, but I have selected a subset of ecoregions that I think kind of give you a nice taste of the range of landscapes we have. And so during these visits in each ecoregion, we'll see a few ecosystems that are found in that ecoregion. And then again, I'll talk a bit about a few of the species, plant and animal species that are associated with each ecosystem. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start in the extreme northeast corner of the state in the Canadian Rockies ecoregion. We're then going to move down into the Columbia Plateau. We're going to move over to the East Cascades ecoregion, then take a visit in the West Cascades, stop here in the Puget Trough, and then we'll conclude in the Northwest Coast ecoregion. All right, so let's get going. We're going to start in that extreme northeast corner, the Canadian Rockies, which includes some of the state's wildest country. We have the Selkirk Mountains here, which extend into British Columbia, as well as the Pend Oreille River, which flows north here. And they're the dominant landforms in this ecoregion. And the mountains here are transitional between the Okanagan Highlands, which is another montane landscape, and the Northern Rockies, or the Canadian Rockies. Some people call this Central Rockies over here in Idaho and Montana. Precipitation ranges from near about 18 inches near the Columbia River, which comes right here in the ecoregion, to about 80 inches near the crest of the Samuel Priest Wilderness area. You get significant snowpack, obviously, at elevation, at mid to upper elevations. And then we also have a unique inland maritime climatic pattern that forms in parts of this ecoregion, which results in a unique forest type we'll talk about in a minute. So, you know, the ecoregion has alpine meadows, dense coniferous forests, high elevation wetlands, riparian woodlands, grasslands, just a whole diversity of different ecosystem types. You get a lot of plants that are common in the Rocky Mountains, but relatively uncommon elsewhere here in Washington. And you also have a high abundance of large mammals, such as moose and endangered woodland caribou, which I'll talk about. Um, at low elevation dry sites, you get ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests, which are relatively common. And these are in the central Rocky Mountain dry mixed conifer forest woodland group. That's the U.S. National Vegetation name. And then that inland maritime climatic pattern produces what we call these inland rainforests, and they're dominated by western red cedar and western hemlock. And those species, you know, they're kind of disjunct from western Washington, and you get a few other species in these rainforests that you typically only find in western Washington. So you get a really unique forest type because some of this maritime influence reaches these mountains. You also get forests dominated by western larch, which is part of the central Rocky Mountain, interior mesic, grand fir, Douglas fir, larch forests. Some of these names are a mouthful. And they occur at mid-elevation and put on just amazing displays in the autumn. You know, larch are one of our few deciduous conifer species, and so they turn this incredible yellow in the autumn, as well as our alpine larch. But most of the area, you have a Rocky Mountain subalpine, moist mesic spruce fir forest, which is dominated by subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. And as I mentioned earlier, you get a lot of large mammal species inhabiting the wild spaces of the Canadian Rockies: white-tailed deer, mule deer, Rocky Mountain elk, moose, bighorn sheep, black bear, but less numerous and a little bit more interesting from a rarity perspective are woodland caribou, gray wolves, wolverines, and grizzly bears are all found in this landscape. Also, the Canadian Rockies is the only location where this little red-tailed chipmunk is found in the state. And it likes to inhabit these mesic forests that are common in the ecoregion. This ecoregion is also the only location in the state where patterned fens are found, which are part of the Rocky Mountain acidic fen group. And fens are a type of wetland called peatlands, and the soil of these wetlands consists of peat, which is dead plant matter that accumulates over time. And patterned fens are found in boreal locations around the world. They form a distinct pattern of ridges and hollows, which you can see in this photo in the lower right. And those ridges are perpendicular to groundwater flow. The Scandinavians call this pattern strings and flarks, which is much more interesting than I've seen anything in the US literature. So I like to use strings and flarks, pretty cool. But the best example in Washington is at Bunchgrass Meadows, which is a research natural area managed by the US Forest Service. And it supports numerous rare plants, rare mosses, such as the state rare streamside sphagnum or Sphagnum riparian. Also many amphibian species. You have Columbia spotted frog, and there's also a rare damselfly. This is the subarctic bluet damselfly. It's only known from 2 fens in Washington state. Another rare peatland type is called the calcareous fen, and these are supported by groundwater that is in contact with limestone or dolomite. And so the result of that is that the water has a high pH, very alkaline, and that results in a unique assemblage of species that are able to kind of survive in those conditions, including numerous rare plants. In fact, these fens support more rare plants than most other wetland types in the state. And you get interesting sedges like carex, flava or yellow sedge, sage leaf willow, Salix candida. My favorite sedge, northern bog sedge, Carex ganocrates. Another willow that's rare called Salix brachiocarpum, and then bucksbaum sedge, which is Carex bucksbaumii. These are all primarily restricted to these calcareous fens. All right, so moving on to the Columbia Basin, I've already mentioned a few times, but this is the most arid part of the state, and it's also the largest, occupying nearly a third of the state of Washington. Columbia River basalt is the primary, almost exclusive bedrock within the ecoregion, at least in most of the central part, and it can be as thick as 6,000 feet in some places, these old lava flows. But you do get windblown silts and volcanic ash that have accumulated over time and cover extensive areas, especially over here in the Palouse region or Southeast Washington, where you get rolling deep productive hills. As I mentioned earlier, these ice age floods carve deep canyons and coulees through the basalt, otherwise known as our scablands. And you can kind of see this on this photo. These are these dark kind of grayish areas. Precipitation increases from west to east, about a 6 inches along the Columbia River. And then by the time you get to the Palouse, it's around 25. Another thing to take notice with the Columbia Basin is the amount of shrub steppe that's been converted. And so there's obviously the irrigation district in the central part of the basin, and then there's just lots of dryland agriculture. A lot of those productive soils have been converted, so we've lost a lot of the ecosystems we find in the state. The primary one being shrub steppe, but I'll get to that in a minute. So this, again, the ecoregion is the only one not dominated by forests, and instead dominated by this ecosystem called shrub steppe, as well as other grasslands. There's also some other interesting kind of smaller patch ecosystems that we'll explore that occur or embedded in the shrub steppe landscape. But together, the shrub steppe and all these other smaller habitats support roughly 45% of Washington's 820 plus vertebrate species. Again, this dominant ecosystem type in the basin is called, technically with the MVC, the US MVC, called the Intermountain Basin's Big Sagebrush Steppe Group, locally shortened to shrub steppe. And this is essentially a grassland with sagebrush, as well as a few other shrubs. And you can see in these photos how much bunch grass there are, and that really dominates kind of the character of these ecosystems. And the sagebrush can vary in density, depending on many factors, sometimes disturbance. But overall, this ecosystem supports numerous rare and obligate sagebrush species only found in this ecosystem. And that includes things like pygmy rabbit, greater sage grouse, Washington ground squirrel, sage thrasher, etc. There's a lot of other species, especially birds, that I'm not mentioning, but are really tied to this ecosystem. And their populations are low and declining because, again, the loss of shrub steppe habitat to conversion to other land uses, but also invasive species. Cheatgrass or Bromus tectorum is just hitting the shrub steppe really hard. And anytime there's a fire over there, which is increasingly pretty often, cheatgrass is commonly comes in after the fire. So fire is a good thing in most ecosystems, but here it results in typically an invasive species. And there are other factors too that related to that. But so there are also grasslands in the mesic parts of the ecoregion, namely down in the Palouse area that I mentioned. The grasslands in the Palouse are often referred to as Palouse Prairie, which you may have heard. In the U.S. National Vegetation Classification, they're part of what are called the Central Rocky Mountain, Lower Montane, Foothill, and Valley grassland. But the Palouse Prairie specifically, which is a unique part of that group, it occurs essentially on ancient sand dunes. All that windblown silt kind of accumulated in that area, but less than 1% of that prairie remains. And most of it is just these little, what we call eyebrows, that are on the sides of the hills that couldn't be plowed. So that's often what we're left with. So most of it's been converted. And there are a lot of rare species associated with this grassland, and rare plants such as the Palouse goldenweed. And then you may have heard of the giant Palouse earthworm, which can grow up to 3 feet long and supposedly smells like lilies. But our former zoologist never was able to confirm that, but he collected some of those species. So in numerous places in the ecoregion, we also have inland sand dunes forming, or that have formed. You get species occupying this environment are adapted to shifting sand, and they can form patchy or open grasslands, shrublands, or even woodlands. And there are like 12, I think, rare plants associated with these dunes, including one here, the state-sensitive gray cryptantha, which is declining. We're very concerned about this species. There are 9 vertebrate species associated with these dunes, including the northern sagebrush lizard, which is restricted to this habitat. Also, the rare desert striped whip snake is associated with the dunes, as well as adjacent shrub steppe habitat. About a decade ago, our program did a study of this ecosystem and determined at that time that about 75% of this habitat had been lost from the early 1970s, again, primarily due to agricultural conversion as well as reservoir flooding. So a lot of the dunes, like the big dune kind of south of Moses Lake, much of that was sand dunes. There still are dunes there too, but also dune stabilization. Plants are coming in, locking the dunes in place, and that is not allowing the dune to be active, all right, to have normal processes happening. Across many parts of the ecoregion, of course, you had ice age floods, which I've already mentioned a couple times. and this is kind of what they look like, pictures of a few of those areas, but they kind of strip the soil off this area, leaving sometimes just basalt or very shallow soils. Locally, these are called scablands or sometimes lithosols. Very rocky, very little soil development, and consequently, the plants that are growing there, are unique. You don't really see them elsewhere on the landscape, and so they have a very unique habitat in plant communities. Vernal pools are a type of seasonal wetland. As their name implies, they can be very wet in spring, early summer, but by late summer, they're often completely dry, sometimes bone dry. But you get a lot of rare species, especially annual plants that live their entire life cycle in one growing season. And that's primarily because these are very harsh sites. But there are a lot of rare species because of that. And then also we get some rare invertebrates like brine shrimp. Most of our brine shrimp aren't super rare. We do have a few. Down in California, these vernal pools have just a plethora of endangered species, a lot of them these invertebrates. Ours, we have more rare plants than invertebrates, but they're a really unique habitat and very, very interesting. And they're primarily associated with the scablands, basically areas where the floods kind of carved out these areas where water accumulates seasonally. So the East Cascades were modified by alpine glaciers and landslides, and it created a lot of rugged ridges and broad valleys between the ridges. Elevations range from around 2,000 feet in the foothills up to 7,000 feet, although Mount Adams goes over 12,000. The lowest elevation is kind of cut off here, but the ecoregion extends down to the Columbia River, and that's about 100 feet. The climate changes rapidly, again, moving from the Cascade crest, where you have cold, very high precipitation, about 120 inches, down to where it's hot and dry with less than 20 inches in the foothills. And the East Cascades is one of the Washington's most biodiverse ecoregions and includes about 10% of the state. Like all of the mountain ecoregions in the state, forests vary in composition based on elevation. So drier forests at lower elevations. And then as you move up in elevation, you get more moisture, and so you get a different suite of species. So you kind of see a common pattern, especially in eastern Washington, of the different forest types. Grasslands are also interspersed and embedded in these forests, and collectively, these and other habitats support nearly 200 bird species, many large mammals, mule deer, black-tailed deer, Rocky Mountain elk, black bear, cougar. And then there are at least 20 endemic plant species in the ecoregion. The central Rocky Mountain whitebark pine, subalpine larch forest and woodland occurs on ridges and other dry areas in the subalpine zone in this ecoregion. This isn't limited to this ecoregion, but it's well developed in many places. And of course, Clark's nutcracker, a common bird species you'll find in these woodlands. They feed on the pine nuts. Also, whitebark pine was recently listed as a federally threatened species. Primarily because of impacts from a non-native white pine blister rust. So it's a pathogen that's actually killing these trees. And I think I'm not confident, but I'm pretty sure that's what's happening with this tree in this photo. And so it's not habitat loss. It's really this other pathogen that really put it on the threatened list, endangered and threatened list. So I mentioned large forests earlier. Those same forests occur here in the East Cascades. And there are actually a few old growth remnants of these forests in this ecoregion that are just absolutely amazing. And the photos on this slide are from one of these stands. You can see how open and park-like it is in the understory, similar to what you might think of as occurring in ponderosa pine forests. So this is at a mid elevation. Ponderosa pines are at a lower elevation. And just really, really incredible forests. I think fire obviously was an important driver of why it's so open, but at this particular stand, it's also what we call due to edaphic conditions, or what we mean by that is soil conditions are very droughty, which is keeping things very open in the understory. I mentioned the grasslands. They're a part of the Rocky Mountain North Pacific, subalpine, montane, mesic grassland and meadows, and they're found throughout the ecoregions, and they can range from being mesic to dry, so moist to dry. They support rare plants such as the federally threatened or federally endangered Wenatchee checker mallow, which occurs in these mesic meadows, as well as a state threatened Wenatchee larkspur, which is also in the same habitat. In the southern portion of the ecoregion, this state endangered marten skipper is found in a few of the meadows where it uses a variety of grasses and sedges for laying its eggs. The marten skipper population is low and declining, and it's only found in about three small isolated, three or four, I guess four isolated populations in the West, the Puget Sound, South Puget Sound region, and then here in the Southeast Washington Cascades, Southwestern Oregon, and Northwest California. So this is one of my favorite forest types. It's just a very beautiful woodland to walk through. This is the Cascadian Oregon white oak conifer forest and woodland. And they're found in the southern portion of the ecoregion where the ecoregion meets the Columbia River. These woodlands are the driest forest type in the state, and they provide habitat to many oak obligate species. We only have one oak species in Washington, and that's Oregon white oak or Gary oak, also known as Quercus garryana. In these oak woodlands, one of three populations of the state threatened western gray squirrel is found in these woodlands. The squirrel uses acorns for food and cavities in the oak and conifer trees for nesting. The state rare Lewis's woodpecker also depends on these woodlands. And also the only place in the state where the California mountain king snake is found is in moist microsites in these oak woodlands. All right, moving west, we enter the West Cascades ecoregion, and this runs southward from about Snoqualmie Pass down to the Columbia River Gorge, obviously west of the Cascade Crest. The West Cascades are a glaciated landscape with numerous river valleys. Peaks approach 7,000 feet. Well, of course, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, and rise much higher. And the Columbia River Gorge at the southern edge of the ecoregion developed at roughly the same time that the Cascades began to uplift, which is why we have that beautiful gorge down there, as well as those Missoula floods helping carve that area. But the ecoregion is affected by Pacific maritime weather systems that move in. And so precipitation consequently is really high, ranging, I think at the lowest about 55 inches at the lowest elevations, up to 140 inches annually at high elevations. With obviously rain at lower elevations, you get a rain on snow zone, and then of course deep snowpacks at high elevations, very deep snowpacks at Mount Rainier. And so this wet and kind of relatively mild conditions in the West Cascades really support just amazing, magnificent conifer forests. Also Mount Rainier and the Columbia River Gorge are specific areas of very high plant diversity. Both support a lot of rare endemic plants. And in fact, the Mount Rainier, I think this statistic is based on the park boundaries, is home to 30% of all the plants that occur, native plants that occur in Washington. So just a wide range of habitats around that area. And the Columbia River Gorge has a biogeographic significance because of the mixing of coastal and interior floras. And so there's kind of an area around Hood River where you get just all these weird mixes of vegetation types. This is where we develop ecosystem keys so we can identify them systematically on the ground. And they always fall apart in that part of the gorge because things are just a mixing zone. Very interesting place though. And then, of course, above upper tree line, the elevation at which trees can no longer grow, but below permanent ice cover, we obviously find our alpine ecosystems, our meadows, our heath fields, talus, and of course, our American pica and the talus slopes, alpine meadows in midsummer, just gorgeous wildflower displays. One of my favorites is Lewis's monkey flower, which occurs along these streams and rivulets. At Mount Rainier, there's the state-sensitive Mount Rainier lousewort, which is found in subalpine and alpine habitats only on Mount Rainier. This is an endemic plant that's just occurs in that area. But obviously, I list many different, at least 3 different MVC ecosystem types here. Your tundra that are well vegetated, more bedrock and scree landscapes, and then our kind of wet habitats in the alpine. So this ecoregion, the West Cascades, also has an abundance of wetlands. You have expansive montane marshes, which you see here in the upper right, shrub and forested swamps, and fens. I mentioned those earlier, those groundwater supported peatlands. And in fact, the area west and southwest of Mount Adams supports the highest concentration of fens in Washington's Cascades. And these fens support a lot of species that don't occur elsewhere on the landscape. Not all of them are rare, but typically you're only going to find these species in fens. So species such as mud sedge, you get this a really interesting plant called podgrass, and then sundews. We have down here in the western Washington, or the lowlands of Pewter Trough, we have Drosera rotundifolia, roundleaf sundew, but up there we get English sundew, which is one of the few places. Also found in these wetlands is Van Dyke salamander, which is endemic to Washington, nowhere else in the world. It's found in 3 distinct areas in the state: the Willapa Hills in the Northwest Coast ecoregion, which we'll visit in a minute, the Olympic Peninsula, and then here in the West Cascades. And the salamander is associated with cool and moist habitats, so it's not restricted to wetlands per se, but it definitely likes moving between wetlands and very moist habitats, moist forests or moist microhabitats in adjacent forests. So a unique forest type that appears to be restricted to this West Cascades ecoregion is what we have called wooded volcanic flowage, because it's associated with old basalt flows. And it's a part of the North Pacific Maritime Douglas fir Western Hemlock rainforest group, which in and of itself isn't rare, but this particular expression of this ecosystem is. And these are open, as you can see in these pictures, they're open to sparsely vegetated woodlands on these recent, relatively speaking, recent volcanic substrates, lava flows, lahars, debris avalanches. And a great example of this occurs on the Big Lava Bed, which you see here in this photo, on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Also, the state-sensitive golden chinkapin, which is a shrub here, doesn't actually occur on these wooded flowage forests, but it occurs essentially right adjacent to it on nearby dry, infertile open forests. And it's only found in 2 locations in the state: the southeast part of the Olympic Peninsula, and then down here in the Big Lava Bed area of the Gifford-Pinchot. What's interesting about that is that there's a state rare butterfly or subspecies of the golden hairstreak butterfly that is strongly tied to the golden chinkapin. So you got two rare species that are associated with each other. All right, so as I noted earlier, the wet and relatively mild conditions of this ecoregion really support amazing conifer forests. In Western Washington at low elevation, we have Douglas fir and Western hemlock, which are the dominant species. But then you also get red cedar in especially in moist sites or moist regions. At mid elevations, we start Doug fir and hemlock are joined by Pacific fir, silver fir, as well as noble fir. And then as you get into the high reaches of the West Cascades, you get mountain hemlock and subalpine fir that starts to mix in as well. And then restricted to older forests, as well as rocky areas in this ecoregion, is the state-sensitive larch mountain salamander. So there's a particular location that is one of my favorite places in the state in this ecoregion called the Goat Marsh Research Natural Area. It's managed by the U.S. Forest Service and is located southwest of Mount St. Helens. And it protects just an absolutely amazing forest dominated by Doug fir and noble fir. And this picture you're seeing here is of that forest. Unfortunately, I don't have anything in there to demonstrate the scale of these trees, but they are immense. And as you can see, the understory is nice and open. It's just incredible to walk through. It's easy. It's out of a fairy tale. It's an amazing place. There's no trails leading into it. Unfortunately, you kind of have to really, you got to put a lot of effort to get into it. But it's amazing. And this forest has been researched a lot. One of the purposes of research natural areas that the Forest Service manages is to do research to help understand these ecosystems, to help, other uses of forest, productivity, et cetera. But this forest, after all that research, has been documented to have the second highest total biomass of any forest in the world. Only coast redwood stands have greater biomass than this forest. So it's really an amazing place. And also in this natural area, there are just incredible wetland complexes as well. Another interesting habitat in this ecoregion, well, most ecoregions, but I think it's best expressed here, are what we call waterfalls and splash zone areas, where you get a unique assemblages of plants growing on the adjacent rocks where water is spraying and keeping it moist. And so if you've driven through the gorge, which I'm sure most of us have, you've seen these waterfalls, you've seen the green surrounding them, and that's the habitat that we're talking about here. And we have the state endangered Oregon Sullivantia, as well as the state threatened Oregon Bolandra and the state sensitive long on sedge. These are all rare plants that are associated with this ecosystem. All right, so the Puget Trough ecoregion runs the length of the state from the Canadian border up near Blaine all the way down to Vancouver. The Puget lobe of the continental ice sheet, as we saw earlier, made its way down to Olympia, Tenino area. And so, you know, the northern half of the ecoregion, it was strongly affected by glaciation. Elevations in the ecoregion are mostly at low elevation, generally below 2,000 feet. The ecoregion has a temperate maritime climate, mild wet winters, warm dry summers. We all know this, we live here. Precipitation mostly falling as rain, averages about 40 inches, but it can vary greatly. I mentioned about 16 inches up in the northeast part of the Olympic Peninsula. And over here in western Mason County, it approaches 80 inches in some places near Matlock. And also, as I mentioned earlier, this is the population center of the state. So there's been a lot of impact, past and present, on our the ecosystems in the ecoregion. Historically, old growth coniferous forest dominated the ecoregion, and then also glaciation left templates for a lot of rare and unusual ecosystem types, which we'll briefly visit. A lot of lakes, again, due to glaciation. And then, of course, Puget Sound's marine waters are home to orcas, porpoises, harbor seals, and it's just that rich marine biodiversity that occurs in the Puget Sound, as well as western outer coast. Majority of the ecoregion, again, as I mentioned, historically had predominant old growth forest dominated by Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar. Most of the old growth is gone, but large areas of the ecoregion are still covered in this forest type. So we still have a lot of this type left, just not a lot in that late seral stage. But we do still have some on state lands and federal lands in other areas. Deciduous species such as red alder and big leaf maple are occasional, especially in disturbed areas or wet areas, but they're also a part of the subcanopy in many of these forests. They historically supported the northern spotted owl, at least in terms of breeding. And then, of course, just some basic critters we're all familiar with: Swainson's thrush. I mean, you know, hearing that song, walking through an old growth forest, is just, welcome home to me. So yellow spotted millipedes, commonly seen on the forest floor, of course, are banana slugs. And also, despite being on the wet side of the Cascade Mountains, we do have dry forests in western Washington. This is 3 different examples. On the left, this is an example of a forest type that forms on coarse and droughty glacial outwash soils. This is really common on the southeast part of the Olympic Peninsula and in Mason County, where there's a lot of outwash there, and you get a Douglas fir as well as shore pine, which are canopy dominance over an understory of what we call dry site indicators, which is plants like salal and Oregon grape. And these forests are part of the Vancouverian dry coastal beech and pine forest and woodland. And actually, so I won't get into the weeds on that one. And as the name suggests, again, associated with glacial outwash, these soils are excessively well drained. So it's not that they're getting less precipitation, it's just that the soils are more well drained and they don't hold moisture as long. And so the response is that of a dry forest that you might see in a more climatically dry area, such as in the rain shadow. And in the rain shadow in the Olympic Peninsula, precipitation drops and you start to get some forest types that are primarily restricted to that area or close to that area. So many of those forests up there have evergreen, huckleberry, and Pacific rhododendron as a common understory, although those particular forests do extend outside the rain shadow. And then as we all know and have seen, another common type we've seen of dry forests are dry Douglas fir and madrone forests that occur along rocky outcrops, especially along the shorelines of Puget Sound. It's really common to see madrone, and they're part of the southern Vancouverian dry Douglas fir madrone woodlands. So within this matrix of conifer forests, we find prairies, and again, they are found on those well-drained soils I was talking about. Fire was an important tool that kept these prairies from being overtaken by conifer trees. Over many centuries, local tribes intentionally burned these prairies to keep the trees at bay, to create open areas to hunt. The historical story, we think, is that during the hypsothermal, which was a very hot, dry period about 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, the climate was conducive for these prairies to be on the landscape. Then that ended, the climate cooled, and Douglas fir and oak started to encroach in these prairies and become more dense. And that's, we think, when the tribes really started using fire frequently. And of course, that happened over many thousands of years. And now it's just a part of these ecosystems. And so natural resource managers today are learning from how the tribes manage these ecosystems. And we're using fire in the same way to manage biodiversity, let alone the culturally important plants associated with those habitats. But these prairies are threatened, land conversion, invasive species, fire suppression, et cetera. All of them are these prairies are, but there's not much left. Again, another one of those was like less than 1%. They have spectacular spring floral displays about now. And we get blue camas, yellow buttercup, the state endangered golden paintbrush that was recently delisted from, it was federally threatened. Also, you have the federally threatened or federally endangered Taylor's checker spot butterfly, the federally threatened Mazama pocket gopher, and federally threatened streaked horn lark are all restricted to this ecoregion. So there's a hotbed of biodiversity and rare biodiversity in this ecosystem. Often near or around these prairies are those oak woodlands we talked about earlier. But here is the west side version of those oak woodlands. Same group in the MVC, but a different expression. So these are structurally different because of the different climate regime here. But they do have some overlap in species. So those the western gray squirrel, again, found in these oak woodlands. But also we have the state threatened state imperiled slender-billed nuthatch and western bluebirds are found, etc. These are they're really cool oak woodlands. So a unique and characteristic wetland ecosystem of the ecoregion are bogs. These are peatlands that only or predominantly get their water from rainfall. And so that's how they differ from fens. They're another type of peatland. But because of that, they're very low in nutrients and very acidic, and they reach their southern extent in Western North America, here in Western Washington. And so they support numerous rare invertebrates and plant species. There was talk earlier before we started about spiders. There's supposedly up to 30 spiders that are primarily found in this ecosystem, which was news to me as of a year ago. Very cool stuff, including the rare Georgia basin bog spider, also rare beetle, rare Beller's ground beetle, and there's a Hatch's click beetle that are restricted to these bogs, and rare plants and mosses as well. Also many other wetland types in the ecoregion, including shrub and forested swamps, marshes, streamside wetlands. Some of these wetland types support the Olympic mud minnow, which is a state-sensitive species that is only found in Washington. It's our only endemic fish species in the state. And it's associated with wetlands and slow-moving streams with lots of aquatic plants. Also, Oregon spotted frog, another rare federally threatened species that's found in these shallow wetlands. So Puget Sound, of course, supports numerous marine ecosystems and species. Our iconic marine species, of course, is the federally endangered southern resident orca population, which as of 2023 had, I think, around 75 individuals. Salmon are an important food source for orcas. So salmon conservation, orca conservation go hand in hand. All right, moving into our last ecoregion. This is, as I mentioned earlier, the Northwest Coast ecoregion is the wettest ecoregion. It extends from the Pacific Ocean up into the Olympic Mountains and as well as Willapa Hills. It includes about 150 miles of ocean shoreline and encompasses roughly 11% of the state. So you have mountains, ocean coast, coastal plain, Willapa Hills. They're all the dominant landforms you see here, and a strong maritime climate. In fact, ecologists often refer to some areas here as what we call hypermaritime. Mild temperatures, frequently overcast days, and lots of precipitation. Precip ranges from about 60 to, as I mentioned earlier, over 200 at the high elevations in the Olympic Mountains. And then in the coastal valleys, such as the Hoh Rainforest, Quinault, the summer fog, as well as cool temperatures, result in a very unique expression of our rainforest that otherwise occurs in other parts of the state. So as I mentioned earlier, the wettest place in the lower 48 is in this ecoregion, and consequently we get just incredibly lush lowland rainforests, which one of the unique characteristics of it is it supports a high amphibian diversity. Also, subalpine, parkland, alpine habitats occur at high elevations where you get the endemic Olympic mountain or marmot. And the Olympic Mountains as a whole, as I mentioned earlier, are rich in rare and endemic plant species due to their isolation. And so they're surrounded by water on three sides, and then you have the Chehalis River on the south side. It's almost like an island, and I think people have argued that based on some of the stream flows, since the Black River, which is here in Olympia, connects to the Puget Sound as well as the Chehalis. So the lowlands support an exemplary example of a temperate rainforest. The region gets, again, extremely high rainfall, on average more than a dozen feet of rain on those coastal plains. Coupled with that mild temperatures, these coniferous forests are some of the most productive on Earth. And many of the largest trees in the world are found here. Sitka spruce, western red cedar, western hemlock are dominant species. It's just ideal habitat for, in addition to the amphibians I was talking about, lots of epiphytic ferns, mosses, and lichens. And what I mean by epiphytic is they're growing on branches and the tree itself, high in the canopy. And as a whole, I mentioned that stand earlier being the one with the second highest biomass in the world. But as a forest type, these temperate rainforests, which extend into the West Cascades, again, hold more living biomass than even tropical rainforests. That's what the research has been telling us lately. Also, elk are a big component to these rainforests. It's a species called Roosevelt elk, and they're bigger than the Rocky Mountain elk, and they really do an incredible job of keeping the forest understory open. And you can really tell where when there's exclusions that are fences that are put up to kind of document and let's study the impact the elk has, and it's really amazing. They're a primary driver there. Marble murrelets they nest in the canopy of these old trees in these forests. Also, you get the rare Keen's myotis bat, which forages in the forest, and they roost in tree cavities and snags. And then, of course, the federally threatened northern spotted owl also is in these forests. And there are all sorts of lichens that are restricted to the old growth stands of these forests. Bogs, I had to put another one. Bogs are my favorite ecosystem type, so I found a way to get a second bog slide in here. But the bogs on the coastal and the northwest coast ecoregion are different than the ones we have in the Puget Trough, just because they're getting so much more moisture. And so they have a different structure, and they share a lot of species, but there are some species that are only found in the coastal version of these bogs. And one of the most unique ones we have is a site that we recently protected as a natural area and did some research out in. It's the only known example of a raised bog in the western coterminous US. In the center of this bog, as you can see in this area here, you can see how it rises. The center is about 3 meters or about 9 feet higher at the top part than the surrounding edge of the wetland. You know, we always think about wetlands being in a depression. This thing comes up, and it's coming up not because of bedrock or some soil deposit there. It's all peat that is accumulated over 15,000 years. And so there's a lot of rare plants and rare mosses, as well as a rare butterfly that occurs out in this particular site. Also, there's a rare moss called the small capsule dung moss. It has a very unique ecological niche. It only grows on elk or deer dung deposited in these bogs. So I think we know of 2 populations in the state. There may be more, but there's not a lot of people looking for that critter. All right, so along the lower reaches of rivers, main rivers on this in this ecoregion, you get a unique type of wetland called surge plain wetlands, and this is where it's what's called a freshwater wedge. As the tides move up the river drainages, like the Columbia River, the Chehalis River, it backs that freshwater up, and then it pushes the freshwater out into adjacent floodplains. And it happens, of course, predictably with the tides. And so you get herbaceous wetlands, shrub wetlands, forested wetlands, etc. And so they're a really unique aspect in some of our major river drainages. Further downstream from the surge plain wetlands, you get more salinity. You're getting things like salt marshes and tidal flats, and basically our estuaries. And of course, the Columbia River estuary is the largest in the Northwest. and very critical for waterfowl, sea wren fish, and the endangered Columbia white-tailed deer. All right, coastal dune ecosystems are found in the southern portion of the ecoregion. They range from being very open, so not a lot of vegetation, and having really active sand dunes like you see here, to becoming more vegetated over time. Some of this is due to an invasive plant, unfortunately, in this particular picture, but we did have, it is natural succession for them to become more stabilized over time. So you have there is a small population of the federally threatened snowy plover that uses these sand dunes, as well as the state-sensitive pink sand verbena, which is restricted to these dunes. All right, so tide pools are common, also common in the Puget Sound region, of course. And they're a hotbed of diversity of nearshore aquatic organisms, sea anemones, sea stars, crabs, etc. I'm sure we've all spent time in them. Very cool. Further offshore, we find kelp beds that are along our outer coast. And when I put this presentation, I did a version of this presentation a few months ago for another group. And when I was putting this together, I learned that we have 22 species of kelp, which apparently is the greatest number of kelp species in the world, except for Japan. So I had no idea. So very cool stuff. So and then I'm almost done here, but I just wanted to talk about broad ecosystem types that are found in every ecoregion and also very important for biodiversity. And the first one being riparian areas along our streams, our creeks, and of course, even our larger rivers like the Columbia. These are vegetated areas immediately along flowing water bodies. And you can imagine the range of ecological complexity. So I'm talking about those small rivulets in the alpine down to the Columbia River, right? So you can think about how different they are across the elevation, let alone the climate and all that. Very important for songbirds, of course, fish, salmon, of course, and then as well as many unique plants that are used there, and wildlife. These are extremely important for almost all wildlife species. And then other open bodies of freshwater, ponds, lakes, etc. Super important for many organisms at all elevations. Again, a lot of variety associated with that. Also associated with geology and bedrock, you get different water chemistry in these lakes, which affects the biota. So that brings us to the end of our excursion, and I've got some QR codes here that link to a couple of web pages where you can find more information. One web page is to the Natural Heritage Program website, which is the program I'm with, and I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but we track the location of rare species and ecosystems across the state. We primarily focus on rare plants because the Department of Fish and Wildlife has statutory authority to do the animals, but we work with them very closely. And if you go to our webpage, we actually have an online web viewer where you can explore where some of these species and ecosystems occur. But you can also visit the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have an amazing amount of information about many of our non-game animals, right? Many of which I talked about today, and many others. And then another resource, it's a little bit outdated, but there's a lot of information about the ecoregions and the conservation issues about all these places I talked about tonight, and that's called Landscape Washington. That was a partnership between our program, NatureServe. So NatureServe is the umbrella organization for all the heritage programs in Canada and the US, and National Geographic. And that was something we worked on about a decade ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. Man, it was longer than that. Time is going by quick. But anyway, there's a lot of really great information there as well. So that should give you more information. I know I threw a lot at you, but frankly, I'm just touching the surface. So there's a lot out there. So anyway, I really appreciate your time, and I'm not sure where we're at in time, if we have time for questions, but happy to do so if we are able.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was just absolutely fantastic. One question that I have is, so are you guys actively purchasing property now to, as you identify new places that are supporting rare species, or is there a program to access or to protect them, I mean? And if so, what's the way that we could help out? Is there need for more funding out of Olympia, or what suggestions you have there?
Yeah, fantastic question. So so DNR, I'll talk a little bit about our sister program at DNR. So there's the Natural Heritage Program, and then our sister program is the Natural Areas Program. And our two programs were established in what was called the Natural Areas Preserve Act of 1972. So we go back a ways. And at that time, the state legislature said, hey, we need a system of natural areas around the state that are protecting representative examples of all this biodiversity that we have for a couple of reasons. One, obviously conservation. We want to preserve these things. Two, research. These places are intended to be represent relatively unimpacted examples of that biodiversity. So they're great places to do research, to learn about them, but also to learn how to manage them, et cetera. And then education. And so that created our program. And the Heritage Program, our role in that is the science. What's rare? Where is it at? What are the stressors? And then the other role our program has is we come up with this framework to do exactly what you're asking about, which is what are the priorities and where should we go to protect species A, B, C, D, ecosystem A, B, C, D. And we describe that in a document that's on our website. It's called the State of Washington Natural Heritage Plan. The current version is 2022. We're just embarking on updating that. And so we have some appendices where we identify what our priorities are. And so then when we do find a site that we think merits being as a natural area, we go through a long process. It unfortunately can take a while moving through state bureaucracy, but also we engage the public. We hold public meetings. We have an advisory council that basically we've got to bring the recommendation to. And then ultimately, if it's a DNR natural area, so we have state partners, we have federal partners that are a part of this network. So that Goat Marsh Research Natural Area is a part of that statewide network. But in DNR, ultimately the Commissioner of Public Lands, decides whether or not to approve it. And so, in fact, I was just out yesterday looking at one of our existing natural area preserves and whether or not we have an opportunity to expand its boundaries. And we were looking at whether or not there was these critical biodiversity features there, and there are. And so we're really excited about pursuing that. So so that was a long-winded way to say yes.
Okay. No, that sounds fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Okay. I must admit that I can't see the chat, so I don't know whether there are questions or whether everyone was totally overwhelmed and doesn't know where to start with the questions.
There are no questions listed in the chat right now.
Right.
Yeah, I realize I threw a lot at you.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that was you did a fantastic job of presenting. Really, really well done.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I do see one comment, it's about, maybe we can go back the slide. Yeah, for the QR code. I think we can certainly make sure that these are available afterwards.
We have a question. Why are bogs your favorite ecosystem?
Hey.
Good question.
Good question.
It goes back to I don't know how far back I go on this. So I grew up in Northwest Indiana, just outside Chicago, very industrial, a lot of ag, not a lot of natural habitats left. I went to Indiana University for my undergrad, and I took a course in wetland biology from a professor who at the time I didn't know was like one of the most well-known kind of wetland professors in the country at the time. And was just inspired by wetlands. And so when I went back home one of my summers, Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which is now a national park, I think our newest national park, had a unit that was you can only visit it under kind of a tour by a ranger. It was a place called Pinhook Bog, and I was like, well, and I saw an advertisement for a hike. I thought, well, I want to go check this out. I mean, I again didn't know what I wanted to do, and I went out there, and it was even though it's a small acreage site, again, surrounded by agriculture, ex-urban development. And as soon as I stepped in, I just felt like I was 2,000 miles to the north. I was just couldn't believe how I was transported like that. I mean, it really was this emotional thing. And that just never left me. I don't know what it was. And so for years, and that's actually a fen. They call it Pinhook Bog, but at the time I didn't know and I didn't care. It was it was just super cool. And when I got to Colorado, wetlands were always my area of expertise. And when I moved to Colorado, I worked for the Colorado Natural Heritage Program there for 8 years. I did a lot of work in the montane areas and really worked a lot on fens, which again are peatlands. And what I love about them is they're ancient. I mean, they are ancient wetlands. They're ancient ecosystems. And then when I moved to Washington, I knew that the diversity of peatlands here was just amazing. And then the bogs just grabbed me. I mean, I love fens too. I mean, the fact that they're just barely here in Washington, there's just so many aspects of it. It's interesting. They're not very diverse from a vascular plant perspective, and they're actually even from an animal perspective, there's not a lot of animal activity going on there, but the mosses are just unreal, and just the ecology is just amazing. They seem like simple ecosystems, but the more we study them, the more we learn how ignorant we are about their ecology. And yeah, I don't know. I could go on and on. I don't know, other than I can only trace it back to that one visit to Pinhook Bog.
Yes.
You had mentioned that cheatgrass was a big problem in the sagebrush habitat. Is there management stuff going on that's trying to control that, or is it just almost impossible to control?
Yeah, I'm not there. Yes, there are efforts. I'm not, I don't spend a lot of my time working on that. At this point, it feels, it's, at least from what we're doing, it's more about how do we prevent it getting established, right? Because it's a nasty cycle. Once it's there, it encourages more frequent fire. And so it just, it just ends up ultimately being converted to what we call an invasive annual grassland. And so, but it's a good question. It's interestingly, I don't know if it's still this way, but it wasn't on a lot of our noxious weed lists, because it has forage value for cattle in the early spring before it goes to seed. So a lot of the counties wouldn't, and now that may be different. It's been a few years since I was looking at those, but ecologically, it's just, and there are other annual grasses that are similar, like bentonata. There are other annual bromes. So cheatgrass is Bromus tectorum. There are other annual species in that same genus that have similar ecological effects, negative effects on our ecosystems. And it's not just Washington, right? It's all over, especially the further south you go. In the Columbia Basin, as you get further towards the foothills, cheatgrass becomes less and less of an issue because it gets more moist, and also the bunch grasses become what we call more closed, more dense. But yeah, it's not a good story.
Getting several thank yous in the
Yeah.
chat for your amazing
I have a question
presentation.
for Joe. I was curious about the prairies that are, and I forget the region this was in, that the indigenous peoples would do burns, right, to be able to keep the prairies open.
Yep.
So how does your agency decide like where to consider what's original habitat, or like that's been a habitat that's been created by human activity, right? Over thousands of years, but that's just an example of how do you navigate what's natural landscape?
So are you asking like how we know their prairies would have been, or more of that because there was human?
Yeah, like if you weren't doing the burns, I mean, I think it's pretty neat that you're following native traditions of doing the burn to keep the prairies open. And if you weren't doing that, these various tree types would start encroaching into the prairie, and you'd lose the prairie. So that's, you could see that perhaps as the natural evolution of the natural environment, right? So but you're choosing to keep the burns going. So my question is more about like, how do you sort of pull apart what is natural versus, you know,
Yeah.
how to, like, where's the line there as to what's original or not?
Such a great question. I spent a lot of my career thinking about that. We have a tool called Ecological Integrity Assessment, and the baseline is really gets to your question. Like, and really it's, you know, early in my career, I think I kind of came out of school with this idea that there was an objective nature, right? Like that was separate from humans, and there isn't. But there is, I think, choices we make on the landscape that result in consequences in our ecosystems, right? And so, and for us, the way that the tribes manage these prairies maintain biodiversity that otherwise is not on the landscape. And that biodiversity has been around for thousands of years on the landscape. And so we had kind of, at least in that ecosystem, to us, that it was a natural kind of part of that ecosystem's dynamics, was that burning. But it's a really good question of like, well, where is that line, right? You could do you extend it to contemporary society, et cetera? And I would say that the practice that was happening over those thousands of years was predictable. It was predictable in terms of scale and intensity relative to what we see today. I mean, the scale of impacts and changes we're making are just unlike anything ever before, right? And so it doesn't mean we don't have that the biodiversity isn't responding. I think to me, it comes down to what do we want on the landscape today? But you're asking a good question. Is that the way it should be? I used to think that we could answer that question. I'm no longer there. It's more about what do we want to have join us on our landscape, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example that's more recent. I'm sure you can think of a bunch of them, but I can't right now. Like, you know, the effect that dams have had, right, on our river systems, and how that's changed the biodiversity. And are there places where that's a good thing versus a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm working with colleagues with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on what's called the State Wildlife Action Plan. It's updated once every 10 years. And we just had this conversation about reservoirs because I'm helping them talk about ecosystem classification and using in that document. And what I first presented was just these natural types, right? Like natural lakes. And they had brought up, well, what about reservoirs? We have really important fish that are dependent on that, right? And so I think to answer your question is, yes, some of our biodiversity, unfortunately, needs some of those what we might call anthropogenic habitats, because maybe elsewhere our anthropogenic activities have eliminated their otherwise natural version of that habitat. So if we want to maintain species A that has those conditions, then that's what we have to kind of do. It's a complicated game. Even in those prairies, we have a rare butterfly. I talked about it, the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. I showed it on that slide. Golden paintbrush, which was federally listed. Both of those, same habitat, same prairie. But the way that we're trying, both need to be recovered. They're declining. They're not in great shape. We're worried about losing them from the landscape and just going extinct. But the actions we can take to maximize conservation of the Taylor's checker butterfly could negatively impact golden paintbrush. And that has to do with the host plant. There's another paintbrush species that the butterfly prefers, but the problem is that paintbrush hybridizes with the golden paintbrush. So conservation can get really complicated, even though that they historically likely occupied similar habitats, and we're trying to figure out, well, why wasn't that hybridization there before? Why is it happening today? And there's likely something about the ecology of those species we're missing, right? But we're trying to figure that out because we're trying to ensure both species remain viable and a part of those prairie ecosystems. So it can be really a challenge when you're basically dealing with, you know, an ecosystem that functionally isn't there anymore. We just have little remnants. And so we have to manage them in different ways. And we have to mimic those natural processes that no longer happen on the landscape, because now fire happens and we put it out.
Yeah, right.
And so we use prescribed burning to be very precise as to where we do those actions. And like the DNR Natural Areas program that I mentioned earlier do prescribe burning on some of our prairie sites for that purpose. But you're right, like I would hate to see, and we did a study down in Clark County on one of our wet prairies where there was an activity maximizing habitat for a rare plant. And I was concerned about, I was advocating, don't do it everywhere on the site, just do it in some places, because there's all this other wet prairie habitat that I don't want to be homogenized. You know, we need some habitat diversity left. So it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
I'm seeing two more questions which might be addressed. One was, one's probably more shorter, asking where one can find more info on natural heritage program resources for transborder ecoregions. That is probably extending from Washington into Oregon or extending from Washington into BC. Is there anything that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if you want, you could reach out to our counterparts in Oregon and British Columbia. So in Oregon, they're called the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center. We call them ORBIC. They are associated with Portland State University and Oregon State University. They're based at PSU though, in Portland. So each heritage program is a little bit different. I mentioned I work for Colorado. That was with Colorado State University. Some are in a state government, like here in Washington. And that has different repercussions on how we operate and what we do just because of funding and all that. And then BC's version is called the Conservation Data Center. So British Columbia Conservation Data Center. And I forgot which ministry they are in, but they're based out of Victoria. So they might have information that you're talking about. We do periodically work with our border partners, including Idaho, on projects here and there. But hopefully that was getting at what was asked.
Yeah. That's it's a good starting point. This is for someone who has a high interest in both Oregon and BC, I happen to know, in addition to Washington. The other question was on the grizzlies, because you spoke about the grizzlies being in the far northeast corner of the state. And there's been so much recently in the papers, I assume, about the reestablishment of grizzlies in the North Cascades.
Yeah.
You say about grizzlies.
I'm not by no means an expert on the grizzly bear, but I know that prior to the recent news of the North Cascades, so that Selkirk area is within occupied habitat or within the range of grizzly bears. I honestly don't know if there's dens or how often they're walking through there, but you go up in the Forest Service area and they have it marked. And so that corner of the state's just really interesting because it's just kind of capturing that whole central Canadian Rockies landscape, which just has all these major carnivores and large mammals still present. So yeah, I've never seen one, but I remember when I was first up there, though, it was a pretty awesome feeling to have to look over my shoulder because they might be there, right?
Yeah. There's also a question, are you actively partnering with Aboriginal peoples in your natural heritage programs?
We do. It's generally, sometimes the tribes will come to us. So for example, on the Peatlands, I've had tribes, the Tulalip, the Quinault, who have invited me to their lands to talk about bogs, to talk about the peatlands on their landscape, to help them kind of understand those habitats from a Western science perspective. And of course, they have their own use and understanding of it. And so I just cherish those opportunities. But it's not something we're necessarily actively, it's a sensitive relationship. And so but anytime we have an opportunity, yes, we are really, in fact, going back to the bogs, and fire, and we were talking about prairies and fire, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest, well, we know there's anthropological evidence that the tribes used fire in the coastal bog ecosystems for the same reasons they did in the prairies, keep them open from woody vegetation, because when things get too woody, sphagnum moss doesn't grow very well, and then the local cranberries don't grow very well. They like it very open and sunny. And so by expanding habitat, they could, you get better berry production, et cetera. So learning from the tribes has really caused me to pause and think, gosh, we really don't know anything about how fire may or may not have impacted our bogs in a positive or negative way. And that's important to me because it's like, well, gosh, that could be potentially an important management tool with changes we're expecting to see in our bogs because of climate change, which is more woody vegetation. And if like I said, if the shrubs get too dense or the trees have a closed canopy, we're going to lose our mosses and they're going to convert to a different ecosystem. And that could be, as was mentioned earlier, part of the natural successional process, but it could also be driven by lack of fire or maybe a fire long ago, which can increase nutrients and allow trees to take off. There's just all this complexity that we don't understand. And to me, again, being really concerned about the bogs is like, I just, there's so much we can learn from our tribal neighbors and friends that, I think they have a lot of potential to offer us and how we might think about managing those. But yeah, and then we have a big project right now with the multiple state agencies and the tribes and thinking about how to look at impacts across the landscape on ecological resources. And so, yeah, I wish it was more often, but we do get those opportunities.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've reached our 8:30 time, and I'm not seeing another question at the moment. So thank you again for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Joe. That was just fantastic.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Absolutely.
Okay. I will
Thank you.
lots of thank yous coming through. That's it. Thanks again.
You.